At his peak, one man controlled a fortune so large that if you measured it against the entire American economy of his day, he was worth more than almost anyone alive. He didn't inherit it, he didn't marry into it, he didn't strike oil or corner a bank. He built a car, a cheap, ugly, reliable little car, and he sold it so cheaply that people laughed at him. That's the part of the story you already know. The farm boy who hated horses, the man who put America on wheels, the $5 day, the moving assembly line. You've heard it 100 times. But there are 3 questions almost nobody answers. 3 questions that every other telling of this story quietly skips over. Here's the first. If Henry Ford kept slashing the price of his car, cutting it in half, and then in half again, how did he end up one of the richest men who ever lived? Where did the money actually come from? Here's the second. This was a man who dominated an entire industry, who owned nearly half the cars on the planet, and then he lost. He lost to someone he never sat across a table from. Who beat Henry Ford, and how? And here's the third, the one nobody wants to say out loud. The Model T, the assembly line, the empire. Did Henry Ford really build all of it himself? Or were there people standing just outside the frame? People whose names got erased so that one man could become a legend. This is the whole story of Henry Ford, the rise, the empire, the collapse. But we're going to tell it through those 3 questions. The money, the war he lost, and the ghosts. Let's begin. Henry Ford was born on July 30th, 1863, on a farm outside Dearborn, Michigan. His father, William, was the son of Irish immigrants who'd fled the potato famine. His mother, Mary, held the family together. 6 children, a working farm, a life measured in seasons and sweat. And here's the first crack in the legend. Henry liked to tell people he clawed his way up from poverty. It made a better story, but it wasn't quite true. The Fords weren't rich, but they weren't poor either. They were successful, respectable, hard-working farmers. Henry never went hungry. What Henry hated wasn't poverty. It was the farm, the endless repetition, the dawn to dusk labor, the feeling that his body was being spent on work a machine could do better. He was maybe 12 years old when 2 things happened in the same year. 2 things every version of this story tells you about. His father gave him a pocket watch. And walking down a country road, Henry saw a self-propelled steam engine chugging along under its own power. He stopped the driver. He climbed all over the thing. He asked question after question. Something clicked into place in the boy's head that never came loose again. He took the watch apart and he learned to put it back together. Soon he was fixing watches for the whole neighborhood. His mother set up a workbench for him. And when his mother died, Henry was just 13. He lost the one person who had truly protected his obsession. At 16, against his father's wishes, he walked the 9 miles to Detroit to become a machinist's apprentice. Now, pause here, because this is where the myth really starts to build. The lone genius. The boy who taught himself everything. The man who owed nothing to anyone. Keep that image in your mind. We're going to come back to it. Because almost every time Henry Ford is remembered as a man who built something alone, there was somebody standing right next to him whose name got left out. Even the very first working gasoline engine he ever built, the one he tested on Christmas Eve of 1893, clamped to the kitchen sink, he couldn't run it by himself. His wife Clara stood there feeding gasoline into it drop by drop while he cranked it to life. Remember Clara? We'll come back to her too. For years, Ford worked his way up through Detroit's machine shops. By his early 30s, he was chief engineer at the Edison Illuminating Company. Good salary, steady future, and he threw it away because he had an idea that wouldn't leave him alone. In 1896, in a shed behind his house, he finished a contraption he called the quadricycle. 4 bicycle wheels, a little engine, a steering tiller, no reverse, no brakes. And here's a detail every telling loves, because it's true, and it's perfect. When he finished it, the machine was too wide to fit through the shed door. So Henry Ford picked up an axe and knocked a hole in the wall of his own building to get it out. That's the man. That's exactly the man. When the world doesn't have a door the right size, he'll cut one. He raised money and launched his first company, the Detroit Automobile Company, in 1899. And it failed. completely. Now, most versions of the story tell you the cars were too expensive, and Ford was a perfectionist who kept fiddling with the design, while investors screamed for a product. That's true, but listen to why it failed, because this is the seed of everything. Henry Ford understood machines. He did not yet understand that manufacturing is a business. He knew how to make one perfect thing. He did not yet know how to make 100,000 affordable things and get paid for all of them. That gap between the perfect product and the profitable system is the whole story of his rise. And one day, it will also be the story of his fall. So Ford tried again. He built race cars, because winning races got his name in the papers and brought investors back. And in June of 1903, with a fresh group of backers, he founded the Ford Motor Company. Then, in October of 1908, he introduced the car that would change the world, the Model T. Now here's where I need you to stop thinking about the Model T as a car. Start thinking about it as a money machine. Because that's the first question we came here to answer. Where did the fortune actually come from? The Model T launched at around $850. That was already cheap for a car in 1908, when most automobiles cost $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, the price of a house. But watch what Ford did next. He didn't raise the price as demand exploded. He cut it, year after year, $850, then $600, then $440, and eventually, by the 1920s, you could buy a brand new Model T for around $260. Now think about that. He cut the price by 2/3, and he got richer. Much richer. How? Here's the math nobody explains. Ford wasn't making his money on the margin of each car. He was making it on volume, on selling a staggering, almost unimaginable number of cars. If you make a small profit on one car, that's pocket change. If you make that same small profit on 15 million cars, you are one of the richest human beings on earth. Every time he cut the price, more people could afford one. Every new buyer pushed his volume higher. Higher volume let him produce even more cheaply. Cheaper production let him cut the price again. It was a wheel that fed itself, and it spun faster and faster, and Henry Ford stood in the middle of it, collecting. Let me make that real with numbers, because this is the trick, and once you see it, you'll never unsee it. Imagine you make just $50 of profit on a single car. $50, that's nothing. That wouldn't have impressed anybody in 1908. But now imagine you sell not one car, but 1 million cars in a single year. That $50 just became $50 million in 1 year. And in his best years, Ford wasn't selling 1 million. He was pushing toward 2 million cars annually. Do the arithmetic and you can watch a fortune assemble itself in front of you. One tiny margin at a time, multiplied by a number so large it stops feeling like arithmetic and starts feeling like weather. This is the thing his competitors could not wrap their heads around. They looked at Ford slashing his prices and thought he was insane, thought he was giving cars away, racing himself to the bottom. What they didn't understand was that every price cut was actually a weapon. It knocked out rivals who couldn't survive on such thin margins. And it dragged in millions of new customers who'd never dreamed of owning a car. Ford was using low prices to buy the entire market. And a man who owns the entire market can afford very, very thin margins because he's collecting them on everyone. At the peak, the Model T wasn't just winning. It was roughly half of every car sold in the entire country. One company, one product, half the market. But here's the part that really made him wealthy. And it's a piece of the money puzzle almost every documentary leaves out. In 1919, Ford bought out every last one of his investors and took the company completely private. Here's the story behind it, because it's pure Henry Ford. Two of his early investors, the Dodge brothers, took him to court. They argued correctly, by the law of the time, that a company exists to make profits for its shareholders, and that Ford was hoarding the company's money to build his own empire instead of paying it out. What made Henry furious was that the Dodge brothers were planning to use their Ford dividends to fund their own rival car company. He was, in effect, being forced to bankroll his competition. The court sided with the Dodges. Ford had to pay out, and his response was one of the coldest, most decisive moves of his entire career. If the law said he had to share his profits with investors, then fine. He would simply get rid of the investors. All of them. So he did, quietly, through a Boston banking firm, so the sellers wouldn't know it was him driving the price. He bought back every single share of the Ford Motor Company. The bill came to more than $100 million. When he was told the plan had worked, that he now owned it all, Henry Ford reportedly danced a jig around the room. Now focus on what it meant. Once the outside shareholders were gone, the Ford Motor Company belonged 100% to the Ford family. Every dollar of profit from every one of those millions of cars flowed into one household. No dividends to split, no board to satisfy, no one to answer to. That is how a man who sold the cheapest car in America became one of the richest men in the world. Not by charging more, by owning everything and selling to everyone. By the mid-1920s, his personal fortune had crossed $100 million, and $100 million in the 1920s is not $100 million today. Adjusted forward, you're talking about a fortune in the billions, controlled by essentially one man and his family. So that's the answer to the first question. The money didn't come from the car. It came from the system that built the car, the volume, the price war, and the total ownership. Now here's the second crack in the legend. We say Henry Ford built the Model T. We should be careful with that sentence. Henry Ford had a vision, that's real, and it mattered enormously. He wanted a simple, tough, cheap car for ordinary people, and he refused to let anyone talk him out of it. But the Model T itself? It was designed by a team. A brilliant young engineer named Childe Harold Wills, who was so broke he couldn't buy company stock, so Ford paid him out of his own dividend. A Hungarian immigrant named Joseph Galam, an engineer named Eugene Farkas, a room full of mechanics who never went to college but could build anything with their hands. These men shaped the car. Their fingerprints are all over the engine, the design, the details. And the assembly line, the thing Henry Ford is most famous for? He didn't invent it either. A car maker named Ransom Olds had used a version of it years earlier. What Ford did was perfect it, scale it, and push it further than anyone had ever imagined. So let's be precise, because precision is fairer than the myth. Henry Ford was not a lone genius who invented a car in a shed. He was something arguably rarer, a man with an unshakable vision, and a genius for organizing other people's genius. That's not a smaller story, it's a truer one. But those men in the room with him, Wills, Galam, Farkas, and the thousands who came after them, history mostly forgot their names. And the people who paid the highest price for the Model T weren't in that design room at all. They were on the factory floor. By 1913, Ford had done it. The moving assembly line was running at Highland Park. Here's the number that made him famous. Building a car used to take around 12.5 hours. On the new line, it took about an hour and a half. Every telling of this story treats that number as a miracle. And in one sense, it was. It's the reason your car exists. It's the reason almost everything you own can be made cheaply. But turn the number over. Look at the other side of it. What does it actually feel like to be the human being on that line? It feels like standing in one spot for 8-9 hours, doing the exact same motion, reaching, turning a bolt, reaching, turning a bolt, thousands of times a day, every day, forever. No craftsmanship, no variety, no sense that you made anything, because you never touched the whole car, only your one small piece of it as it slid past you and vanished. Ford's own people broke it down coldly. They calculated how many jobs on the line could be done by an able-bodied man, how many by a man with one arm, how many by a blind man. Human motion, sorted like machine parts. One journalist who saw the plant described it as a jungle of wheels and belts and men, a place filled with the sound of a million monkeys quarreling, a million lions roaring, a million sinners groaning as they were dragged down to hell. That was the soundtrack of the miracle. That was the noise the modern world was born in. And the workers did what any human being would do. They quit, in droves. The turnover was catastrophic. At one point, to add 100 men to the workforce, Ford's company had to hire nearly 1,000, because most of them walked out within days. The line was so monotonous, so exhausting, so soul-crushing, that people would rather have no job than that job. This was a crisis, not a moral one in Ford's eyes, a financial one. You cannot run a high-speed assembly line if you're constantly training brand new workers who don't know what they're doing. So in January of 1914, Henry Ford did the thing that turned him into a folk hero overnight. He announced the $5 day. He would pay his workers roughly double the going wage. The press lost its mind. Other businessmen called him a traitor to his class, said he'd ruin the entire industry. The next morning, 10,000 men showed up at the factory gates begging for work. And here's how the story is usually told. Henry Ford, the working man's friend, sharing his profits out of the goodness of his heart. But look at it as a piece of the money machine, because that's what it was. The $5 day solved his turnover problem at a stroke. Workers stopped quitting. Training costs collapsed. The line ran smooth and fast. And there was a second move underneath it, colder and smarter. Ford understood that a worker who earned $5 a day was a worker who could afford to buy a Ford. He was manufacturing his own customers. Every raise he paid came back to him through the showroom door. It was brilliant. It was also not charity. And it came with strings. Strings most people never hear about. To get the full $5, a Ford worker had to pass inspection. Ford sent investigators from something called the sociological department into workers' homes. Was the house clean? Did the man drink? Was he legally married? Did he keep boarders? Did he send too much money back to the old country? If you failed, they held back your money. If you failed again, you were fired. Immigrant workers, dozens of nationalities, speaking 100 languages, were required to attend an English school and then march through a ceremony where they climbed into a giant symbolic melting pot in their old country clothes and came out the other side in American suits, waving little American flags. Part of Henry Ford genuinely believed he was helping these men, and part of him believed he had the right to reach into their homes and reshape their lives. Both things were true at once. And as the years went on, the helping hand turned into an iron fist. Ford handed control of his factories to a former boxer named Harry Bennett, who built a private security force of ex-convicts and strongmen who ruled the plant through fear. Workers weren't allowed to talk on the line, weren't allowed to sit. Men suspected of organizing were beaten and thrown out. In 1937, when union organizers came to hand out leaflets outside the plant, Bennett's men attacked them in front of photographers. The pictures ran in newspapers across the country. The beating had a name. It became known as the Battle of the Overpass. The man who freed America to move had built one of the most controlled, most surveilled workplaces in the country. And now, here's the ghost I promised you at the very beginning. The one standing closest of all. Clara. Clara Ford is remembered, when she's remembered at all, as the woman who fed gasoline into an engine on a kitchen counter. A footnote. A supporting character. But it was Clara who finally broke the union standoff. When Henry swore he'd shut down every factory before he'd ever sign a contract with the union, it was Clara who told him, in private, where the history books almost missed it, that she would leave him if he didn't sign. He signed. One of the most important moments in the history of American labor, and it turned on a woman whose name barely appears in the story. That's the pattern. Over and over. The engineers who designed the car, the workers who built it, the wife who steered the man, standing just outside the frame while the legend swallowed all the light. But now we come to the strangest part of Henry Ford's story, because at the exact moment he stood on top of the world, half the market, a private empire, a hero's face on every newspaper, he was about to lose, and he was going to lose to a man most people have never heard of. His name was Alfred Sloan, and he ran General Motors. Sloan was everything Ford was not. Ford was a mechanic, a tinkerer, a man of the factory floor. Sloan was cool, precise, an organizer of systems and psychology. Ford thought about the car. Sloan thought about the customer's mind. And Sloan looked at Henry Ford's empire and found the one weakness in it. The very thing that had made Ford unbeatable was about to become the thing that beat him. Here was Ford's philosophy, and he said it out loud, and he meant every word. One perfect car, made as cheaply as possible, forever. He famously said a customer could have the Model T in any color he liked, as long as it was black. Black paint dried fastest, so black meant more cars per day. Efficiency was a religion, and the Model T was its scripture. For years, that philosophy crushed everyone. Why would you buy anything else, when the Model T was cheaper and tougher than anything on the road? But Sloan understood something about human beings that Henry Ford refused to accept. Once everybody owns a car, once the country is saturated, people don't just want a car anymore. They want a better car, a newer one, a car that says something about who they are. So Sloan built a completely different machine. Not a manufacturing machine, a desire machine. He gave General Motors a car for every step of the ladder. A cheap Chevrolet at the bottom, then Oldsmobile, Buick, and Cadillac at the top. A car for every purpose, he called it. You started poor with a Chevy, and as you climbed in life, GM had the next car waiting to reward you. Then he did something Ford considered almost insulting. He changed the design every single year. New styling, new colors, so that the car in your driveway, a perfectly good car that still ran fine, suddenly looked old, suddenly embarrassed you a little in front of the neighbors. And then the killer blow. Installment credit. General Motors let you buy on time, a little each month. Ford believed you should save up and pay cash, the way a farmer would. But Sloan understood that a man will buy a more expensive car today if he can pay for it slowly. Credit didn't just sell cars. It sold bigger cars to people who couldn't otherwise afford them. Put those three moves together: a car for every rung of the ladder, a fresh design every year, and easy monthly credit, and you have something Henry Ford had no answer for. He had built a machine to manufacture cars as cheaply as possible. Sloan had built a machine to manufacture wanting, and wanting never runs out. A cheap car satisfies a need, but Sloan wasn't selling to your needs. He was selling to your pride, your ambition, your quiet fear of being left behind. Those appetites are bottomless. You can sell into them forever. Now watch the money, because this is where the numbers turn against Henry Ford for the first time in his life. Chevrolet, available in practically any color except black, started climbing, and the Model T, unchanged, unchanging, black, started to slip. Ford's share of the market cracked below 50% and kept falling. And it didn't stop falling. Ford dropped to second, then to third, behind Chrysler and General Motors. Think about how astonishing that fall is. This was a company that had owned half of everything. A company so dominant it looked permanent, the way a mountain looks permanent. And in the space of just a few years, it slid to third place, passed by companies that, not long before, had been chasing him. The greatest money machine ever built was seizing up, and the reason was almost poetic. Henry Ford had built his entire fortune on refusing to change, on finding one perfect answer and holding it against the whole world. That stubbornness made him, and now the exact same stubbornness was unmaking him. Inside the company, one man saw it coming, and that man was Ford's own son. Edsel Ford was everything his father wasn't: gentle, artistic. He loved beautiful design. He could see, plain as day, that the world had moved on, that people wanted color and style and choice, that the Model T was a corpse the company was refusing to bury. And Edsel begged his father to change. It became a slow, quiet war inside that family. Edsel would bring plans for a new car. Henry would send him away. There's a story, and it tells you everything, that Ford's team once built a prototype of a car to replace the Model T while Henry was traveling in Europe. When he came home and saw it, he walked around it once, opened the door, and tore it off its hinges with his bare hands. Then he ripped off the other door. Then he destroyed the whole car by hand, in front of his men. The message was simple: there is one man in charge here, and it is not you. He humiliated his son in smaller ways too. When Edsel started digging a foundation for a new office building the company badly needed, Henry told him to stop. Then he told him to leave the empty hole exactly where it was. And every single day, on his way into work, Edsel had to walk past that hole, a monument, dug into the ground, to his father's contempt. For more than a year, Edsel kept bringing the plans, and for more than a year, Henry kept refusing. until the sales numbers got so bad that even Henry Ford couldn't argue with them anymore. In May of 1927, they shut it down. After 15 million cars, the Model T was dead. Ford closed the mighty River Rouge plant for 6 months to retool. The man who beat the entire world had finally been beaten, not by a rival across a table, but by a philosophy he refused to update, and by a customer he refused to understand. That's the answer to the second question. Henry Ford lost to Alfred Sloan. He lost because he sold a product, and Sloan sold a feeling. And in the end, people will always pay more for how a thing makes them feel. It's the oldest lesson in business, and the greatest industrialist in history had to learn it the hardest way there is. The new car, the Model A, arrived at the end of 1927, and it was largely Edsel's triumph. His eye, his sense of style, 4 colors, a real modern design. America went wild for it. 1 million sold in the first year, 4 million within a few years. Ford was back on its feet, and Henry took the credit. Of course he did. Now, I told you at the start we would tell this story honestly, all of it, and that means we don't get to skip the darkest part. Around this same stretch of his life, Henry Ford used his enormous fortune and fame to do real harm. He bought a newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, and turned it into a weapon. For years he published vicious anti-Semitic articles, blaming Jewish people for the world's troubles, for war, for the corruption of society. He collected those articles into a book. That book was translated and spread across Europe, including into Germany, where a rising politician named Adolf Hitler admired Henry Ford and kept his picture on the wall. There's no soft way to say it, and we shouldn't try to find one. The same man who liberated ordinary people to travel, who paid his workers a living wage, also poured poison into the world that helped feed one of the greatest crimes in human history. Both of these things are true about the same person. A full story holds both. The inspirational versions that leave this part out aren't telling you about Henry Ford. They're selling you a cartoon. His personal life darkened too. His grip tightened. He leaned harder on Harry Bennett and the world of spies and enforcers, and he pushed his son Edsel relentlessly, criticizing him, undermining him, setting Bennett to watch him. And it broke Edsel, not with fists, with silence and pressure and years of a father's disapproval. Edsel developed stomach ulcers, then stomach cancer, and in May of 1943, at just 49 years old, Edsel Ford died. Henry Ford was shattered, because somewhere underneath the ego and the stubbornness, he knew the pressure he'd put on his son had helped kill him. For months afterward, he wandered the grounds of his estate alone at night. One of his associates asked him if he'd ever been cruel to Edsel. Not cruel, the man said, but unfair. Henry Ford himself died on April 7, 1947, at the age of 83. There's a story that on his last night a storm knocked out the power to Dearborn, and the man who had electrified the modern world spent his final hours by candlelight, the way he had as a boy on the farm. 100,000 people filed past his coffin to pay their respects. They didn't come for the author of those hateful articles. They didn't come for the man who spied on his workers or broke his own son. They came for the man who had, more than any other, dragged them into the 20th century. So let's close the loop. 3 questions. Where did the money come from? Not from the car, from the system, the endless volume, the price war that fed on itself, and the total private ownership of an empire that sold to everyone and answered to no one. Who beat him? Alfred Sloan and General Motors. Not with a better factory, but with a better understanding of the human heart. Ford sold the perfect object. Sloan sold the feeling of moving up in the world, and the feeling won. And who really built it all? A wife feeding gasoline into an engine, a room of engineers whose names got swallowed by a legend, 100,000 workers standing on a line, doing one motion until it hollowed them out. Henry Ford had the vision. That was real, and it was rare. But he did not build the empire alone. No one ever does. The myth of the self-made man is exactly that, a myth. There is always someone standing just outside the frame. Here's the thing you should carry out of this. You are living inside Henry Ford's world right now. The 8-hour workday, The idea of a middle class that can afford the things it makes, the suburbs, and the highways, and the whole shape of a country built around the automobile. The way almost every product you own is manufactured, piece by piece, on a line, by people doing one small task. The very idea that ordinary people deserve to move, to go where they want, when they want, under their own power. He gave the world all of that, and he did it with a genius that lifted millions of lives, and a blindness that helped darken millions of others. So here's the question I'll leave with you, and I actually want to know what you think, so tell me down in the comments. Was Henry Ford the man who set ordinary people free, or the man who built the machine that turned human beings into parts? Was he the last great self-made man, or proof that no one is ever truly self-made, that behind every legend there's a crowd of people history decided to forget? Maybe he was all of it at once. Maybe that's what makes him worth arguing about 100 years later. If this changed the way you see the man on the badge of half the trucks in America, do me a favor, hit subscribe, and stick around. Because the people standing just outside the frame of history, they've almost always got the better story. I'll see you in the next one.